You've probably heard the term exposure triangle and wondered exactly what it meant and how it related to video. In this video, we'll break it down in simple terms that hopefully you can get a better understanding and use it to help improve the quality of your videos. So let's jump right in. Isom Phillips here. Thanks so much for watching. The word photography is derived from the Greek and basically means painting with light. The camera uses three components to paint with light and produce properly exposed still images as well as video. While the 3 points on the triangle, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, are the same for both still photography and video, there are other variables that come into play when shooting video. First, it helps to understand exactly what the 3 points on the triangle are and why each one is important to getting proper exposure. In simple terms, aperture is just the size of the opening of the lens. The larger the opening, the more light that gets through. The smaller the opening, the less light gets through. Aperture also determines what's in focus and what is blurred out in the background, also known as depth of field. The smaller the aperture number, such as 1.8 or 2.0, the shorter the depth of field, allowing you to separate your subject from the background. And that's good for portraiture and for highlighting your subject. A higher aperture number, like f16 or f22, has a smaller opening, letting in less light and allowing most everything in the image to be in focus. One use for a higher number aperture like f16 or f22 would be landscapes shot in bright daylight. Shutter speed is a measure of how long the shutter is open, allowing light to get to the sensor. The longer it's open, the more light reaches the sensor. The shorter the duration of time it's open, the less light reaches the sensor. In video, the shutter speed is tied directly to frame rate, and we'll get into that a little bit later. ISO is a measure of sensitivity of the film or digital sensor to light. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive the surface is to light. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive. The lower number, while being less sensitive to light, will give you the best image quality, but it will require more light. Higher ISO numbers, while they allow you to produce images in lower light, they do introduce noise or a grainy look that may not give you the best image quality. Just remember this, photography and videography are art forms, so even though these rules are a guideline for exposure, it's okay to break the rules to make more creative choices. For example, you may want to make a scene darker or lighter to portray a certain mood or look, or you may want to switch to a high ISO setting to get a grainy black and white look to create a certain mood or style. As I mentioned earlier, shutter speed is tied to frame rate when you're shooting video. To get the most natural looking cinematic footage, the rule of thumb is always to take the frame rate, say 24 frames per second, and double it to get the shutter speed. So using a resolution of 1080p or 4K with a frame rate of 24 frames per second would require a 1/48 second shutter speed. But most cameras only have 1/50th of a second, so you would naturally use that. Since the frame rate and the shutter speed are tied together as a constant, that leaves only the aperture and the ISO to be determined to get the best video exposure. When making decisions about ISO, I like to always go for the lowest possible number for the best image quality. I try to stay at 400 maximum, but I can push it to 800 if necessary to get proper exposure. It just depends on how much light is available. Modern DSLRs and mirrorless cameras today allow you to go to some crazy high ISO settings, so just be careful not to go so high that you introduce a lot of noise or grain in your footage, unless that's the look you're going for. As I mentioned, setting aperture can largely depend on the depth of field and how much of a scene you want to be in focus. For videos such as this one, I try to maintain a wide aperture to keep myself in focus and blur out the background. I also like to use different colored lights to separate myself from the background. Trying to use wide apertures outdoor in bright daylight, however, presents a problem. When you try to use a wide aperture such as 2.8, 3.5, or even 4.0, your footage will be way overexposed and blown out. That's where an ND filter comes in. An ND filter, or neutral density filter, acts as a shade for your lens, allowing you to shoot at wider apertures and lower ISO without overexposing your footage. The best way to use the exposure triangle? Just grab your camera and experiment using different ISO and aperture settings along with your resolution and frame rate. Experiment in different lighting conditions and discover what settings work best for you. Stay away from using auto. I'll leave links in the description for some ND filters and other tools that can help you get better image quality in your videos. Give this video a like if you got value from it and consider subscribing. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and we'll see you in the next one.